Imagine waking up one morning to find that the most essential piece of your child's life, a piece of equipment that keeps them mobile, independent and safe, has been taken. No warning, no notice, just gone. That's exactly what happened to the Thompson family. A family like any other, living peacefully in a suburban neighborhood governed by the local HOA. But peace doesn't last long when Karen enters the picture. Karen, a self-proclaimed enforcer of community rules, had developed a reputation for overstepping boundaries. She was always ready to cite neighbors for minor infractions. A slightly overgrown lawn, a mailbox that was off-center, even a garden gnome placed incorrectly. But no one expected her obsession to escalate to something far more sinister. It all started when the Thompsons received a vague note slipped under their door. The note claimed that certain equipment in their home violated HOA regulations. The note was unsigned, but everyone in the neighborhood knew who it came from. Karen. At first, the Thompsons thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the equipment could be relocated, they thought. But before they could respond, the unthinkable happened. One morning, the Thompsons returned from a brief outing to find their driveway eerily quiet. Their child's specialized wheelchair, essential therapy devices, and other adaptive equipment were missing. Security cameras revealed Karen herself arriving early in the morning, clipboard in hand, acting as if she had the authority to confiscate private property. Neighbors who saw her later described a chilling lack of remorse, as if taking someone else's property was routine. The emotional toll was immediate. The child, dependent on this gear for daily mobility and therapy, was left stranded, unable to attend school or participate in activities. The parents were shocked, helpless, and terrified. They tried contacting the HOA office, only to be met with vague responses and bureaucracy that seemed designed to protect Karen rather than their family. At this moment, the Thompsons realized something horrifying. Karen didn't just overstep. She had crossed into illegal territory. Taking a disabled child's medical equipment without consent wasn't just rude or unethical. It was grand larceny, a serious criminal offense. Panic turned into action. They contacted local law enforcement, prepared documentation, and reached out to legal counsel. What happened next would shock the entire neighborhood. Karen, confident in her authority, had no idea that her actions were about to backfire in the most dramatic way possible. Justice, it seemed, had its own schedule, and it was coming for her. As soon as the Thompsons realized what had happened, they didn't waste a second. They gathered evidence, security footage showing Karen arriving in the early hours, photos of the equipment before it disappeared, and the vague HOA note that hinted at her involvement. They compiled every scrap of proof meticulously, knowing that taking action against someone like Karen would require solid documentation. When they contacted the police, the first response was cautious. Many law enforcement officers have seen neighborhood disputes escalate unnecessarily, but the moment the Thompsons mentioned that medical equipment for a disabled child had been taken, the conversation changed. Suddenly, this wasn't a petty HOA complaint. It was a serious criminal case. An officer told them bluntly, "This is grand larceny. Someone's about to face very real consequences." Meanwhile, word began to spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had endured Karen's relentless policing of minor infractions felt a mix of shock and vindication. Some quietly admitted they had feared her for years, avoiding confrontation because she had a knack for making small disputes feel terrifyingly official. Others expressed outrage that someone could think they were above the law, taking a child's essential equipment as if it were a matter of HOA rules. The Thompsons also reached out to their lawyer, who immediately prepared a formal complaint to both the HOA and the local authorities. The lawyer explained that Karen's actions were not only illegal but also morally reprehensible, particularly because the victim was a vulnerable child. He stressed that pursuing legal action was essential, not just for justice, but to prevent her from doing this to anyone else. Karen, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued her routine enforcement. But the first warning signs arrived in the form of a knock on her door, a police officer serving her with a notice to appear for questioning. Reports from the neighbors indicated that Karen was incredulous, insisting she had simply enforced the rules. She did not seem to comprehend the gravity of her actions. As Karen's initial defiance began to crumble, the neighborhood watched closely. Some were filled with hope. Perhaps this would finally put an end to her reign of intimidation. Others were skeptical, wondering if someone so bold would face any real consequences. But one thing was certain. The story had escalated beyond HOA disputes, beyond personal vendettas. It was now a legal battle with serious stakes. The Thompsons, meanwhile, focused on their child's well-being, ensuring that therapy and mobility could continue despite the chaos. They refused to let fear dictate their lives. Instead, they became determined to see this through, knowing that justice for their child meant holding Karen accountable, no matter how long it took. The morning after Karen was served with a notice, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. People exchanged glances. Some relieved, some still skeptical. But everyone knew the story had changed. What started as a petty HOA spat had now become a full-blown criminal investigation. The Thompsons were at the center, providing evidence and recounting every detail of the theft, while authorities began piecing together the timeline. Detectives arrived at the Thompsons' home, reviewing security footage frame by frame. Each shot of Karen carrying the child's wheelchair, each step she took past neighbors' windows, became crucial evidence. Investigators noted the calculated manner of her actions. She had arrived with purpose, as if taking property was part of her job. Statements from neighbors corroborated the footage. Some described seeing Karen loading the equipment into her car, while others recalled her ignoring their protests entirely. Simultaneously, the HOA received a formal complaint from the Thompsons' lawyer, demanding immediate action. The board was caught off guard, while some members privately admitted discomfort with Karen's extreme enforcement. No one had expected her behavior to cross into criminal territory. The HOA's leadership now faced scrutiny for allowing her unchecked authority. Their previous excuses, she was only following rules, fell apart under the weight of evidence and law enforcement interest. Karen herself maintained a facade of calm during initial questioning, insisting she had every right to enforce community rules. But detectives pressed on, methodically pointing out each violation, taking private property, targeting a disabled child, and ignoring legal warnings. Slowly, her confidence began to falter. Her carefully constructed persona of authority was cracking under the weight of reality. Meanwhile, the Thompsons focused on healing. Their child's essential equipment was returned under police supervision, but the emotional scars lingered. The family realized that this incident wasn't just about stolen property. It was about safety, dignity, and the lesson that no one, not even a self-appointed enforcer, is above the law. They shared their story with neighbors, raising awareness about the potential dangers of unchecked authority in HOAs. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the legal consequences would be significant. Karen was facing more than community backlash. She was confronting criminal charges that could result in jail time. The neighborhood, once silent, now watched in anticipation, realizing that justice was finally catching up. The question remained, how would Karen respond? When the reality of the law collided with her sense of self-importance, the stage was set for an intense confrontation, one that would determine not just her fate, but send a message to anyone thinking they could exploit power for personal vendettas. The day Karen finally stepped into the courtroom, tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. The Thompsons arrived early, their child safely in tow, clutching the restored wheelchair that had been at the center of this ordeal. Reporters and neighbors filled the seats, drawn by the story of a community gone too far, and the shocking theft of a child's medical equipment. Karen entered, clipboard in hand, projecting the same air of authority she had wielded in the neighborhood. But inside, something had shifted. Gone was the unshakable confidence. In its place was a careful, calculated attempt to appear composed, despite the seriousness of the charges. Grand larceny wasn't a misdemeanor, and taking property from a disabled child made it even more severe. She knew this wasn't just a warning, this was real, and it carried heavy consequences. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the case. Security footage, neighbor testimonies, police reports, and photographs of the stolen equipment were presented meticulously. Each piece of evidence painted a vivid picture of premeditation, showing Karen entering the Thompsons' driveway, taking the child's wheelchair and adaptive devices, and removing them from the premises without consent. The narrative was clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of theft. Karen's attorney tried to argue that she was enforcing HOA rules and had no intent to commit a crime. But the courtroom was not convinced. The judge, stern and unyielding, reminded the jury that intent alone was insufficient. Taking property from someone, especially a vulnerable child, is legally punishable, regardless of perceived authority. The argument that HOA regulations could override personal property rights held no weight in the eyes of the law. Throughout the trial, the neighborhood watched closely. Some felt vindicated, finally seeing someone who had terrorized them face accountability. Others were still in shock, struggling to reconcile the person they knew who complained about crooked mailboxes and lawn heights, with the person now accused of a criminal offense involving a child. For the Thompsons, the trial was emotionally draining. Each testimony, each replay of security footage, was a reminder of the trauma their family had endured. But the turning point came when the judge asked Karen to speak. Her voice, once commanding, now trembled slightly as she insisted she had only been following the rules. It was a moment of reckoning, showing that her confidence had been nothing more than a shield, a fragile facade hiding the reality that she had broken the law. The courtroom was silent, the weight of justice hanging heavily in the room. The stage was now set for the jury's decision, one that would not only decide Karen's fate but send a resounding message about accountability, authority, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. After days of tense testimony, meticulous evidence presentation, and emotional accounts from neighbors, the courtroom finally fell silent as the jury prepared to deliver their verdict. The Thompsons sat together, their child at their side, holding the wheelchair that had been at the center of this nightmare. Everyone knew the stakes. Karen's fate, and a statement about accountability, hung in the balance. The jury returned, and the foreperson stood, reading the words that would change Karen's life. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of grand larceny and theft of property belonging to a disabled child. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Some neighbors cheered quietly, others wiped away tears. For the Thompsons, relief washed over them, mingled with a lingering sadness over what their child had endured. Justice had been served, but the emotional scars remained. Karen's reaction was a mixture of shock and disbelief. For months, she had wielded power in the neighborhood with a sense of invincibility, believing HOA rules allowed her to dictate anyone's life. Now, confronted with the reality of her actions, she could no longer hide behind authority. The judge's gavel came down, final and unwavering, signaling not just the verdict, but the accountability that had been long overdue. Sentencing followed shortly after. Karen was ordered to serve time in jail, pay restitution for the stolen equipment, and undergo mandatory ethics training. The court emphasized the seriousness of taking property from a vulnerable individual, making it clear that no one is above the law. Karen, once a figure of intimidation, had now become an example of how crossing legal and moral boundaries carries consequences. For the Thompsons, the aftermath of the trial was bittersweet. Their child's equipment had been returned, therapy resumed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the emotional toll could not be erased entirely. They channeled their experience into advocacy, speaking to local communities and HOA boards about the importance of respecting personal boundaries and protecting vulnerable residents. Their story became a cautionary tale, showing how unchecked authority can escalate into criminal behavior. The neighborhood, once fearful of Karen's relentless enforcement, began to heal. The HOA board implemented stricter oversight to prevent future abuses of power. Neighbors who had felt powerless now realized that standing up for what's right can make a tangible difference. Karen's fall from perceived power served as a stark reminder. Authority does not equal immunity. As the courtroom emptied and the Thompsons left, the message was clear. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about restoring balance, protecting the vulnerable, and sending a powerful signal that abuse of power will never go unnoticed. With the trial behind them, the Thompsons began the long process of healing. The nightmare of having their child's essential medical equipment stolen had ended, but the emotional scars remained. Every time they looked at the restored wheelchair, they remembered the fear, helplessness, and frustration that had defined those dark days. Yet amidst the pain, there was also relief, a sense that justice had been delivered and that their family had the opportunity to reclaim normalcy. The neighborhood, too, felt the ripple effects of the ordeal. Karen's conviction was more than just a personal consequence. It was a powerful reminder that authority has limits and must always be exercised responsibly. Residents who had once tiptoed around HOA rules in fear now felt empowered to speak up. They realized that unchecked power, when left unchallenged, can harm even the most vulnerable members of the community. Karen's fall served as a stark warning. Intimidation, cruelty, and disregard for human dignity will not be tolerated. For the Thompsons, advocacy became a natural next step. They began sharing their story in local forums and community meetings, emphasizing the importance of protecting disabled children and holding HOA officials accountable. Their efforts resonated widely, inspiring other families to document interactions carefully, know their rights, and speak out against abuses. What had started as a terrifying personal experience evolved into a movement of awareness and protection, turning their suffering into positive action. The HOA board, embarrassed by the incident, implemented stricter checks and balances. They introduced policies to ensure no single individual could wield unchecked power again, including mandatory transparency, reporting procedures, and community oversight for enforcement actions. The hope was clear: to prevent anyone from abusing authority in the future, ensuring the safety and dignity of all residents. As for Karen, her life had changed dramatically. The once feared enforcer of petty rules now faced a legal record, and the social consequences of her actions. Her story spread throughout the community, a cautionary tale for anyone tempted to overstep boundaries in the name of self-appointed authority. Her confidence had been replaced with accountability, her facade stripped away by the law and the moral outrage of those she had harmed. Ultimately, the story of the Thompsons and Karen underscores a timeless lesson. Standing up for what is right matters, even when fear or intimidation looms large. Protecting the vulnerable, documenting injustices, and holding wrongdoers accountable are the foundations of a just community. And for one neighborhood, the ordeal was a wake-up call, proving that courage, justice, and compassion can prevail against even the most audacious abuse of power. The Thompsons looked toward the future, not just as survivors but as advocates, ready to ensure that no child or family would ever face such injustice again. If you found this story shocking, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an outrageous HOA story. Drop a comment below telling us what you would do if Karen came to your neighborhood. And give this video a like if you think justice was served.